glad everybody has decided to make this a priority today. Matt from Minden, welcome. Glad to have all of you here. While we're waiting for some others to join us, I might just make you aware of some upcoming events. Sherry, if you want to share the next slide. Mike, welcome. You've had a busy couple days. I'm glad you could make it. We always like to share some important dates and information with our attendees. And these are the ones that I'm aware of. If you know of something else, feel free to add it in the chat box, or something coming up in the next 6 weeks or so. Feel free to drop me a line. But July 15th, the Department of Economic Development is doing their 2020 Owner-Occupied Rehab webinar. They are in the process of doing different webinars already, but for the Owner-Occupied Rehab, that is on July 15th. Anissa Rasmussen is your contact information, and you can find out more about that webinar at the link provided. And then July 17th, the Nebraska Investment Finance Authority's Housing Study Grant application deadline is on the 17th, and for more information on that, feel free to contact NIFA at the website there. And I wanted to check this next date. When I prepared this slide, I was thinking July 29th, but then I had heard July 30th. So if somebody is on the webinar today from DED, could you just confirm what the pre-application date is for the owner-occupied rehab pre-application? So for more information on that, feel free to visit DED's website there that is listed. So that is coming right up, and it's a great program for our communities to participate in. So we are grateful for the partnerships that we have with NIFA and DED, and we appreciate both the agencies and their staff and the work that they do to promote housing all across Nebraska. So kudos to all of you. And I learned on a webinar, I just got done with Rural X here today, and they did a lot of sharing of hands, clapping of hands by doing this. I don't know if you can see me, but kudos to all of you. So I do want to honor everybody's time as you're joining us. So let's go ahead and get underway, shall we? So let me just formally welcome you and introduce myself. I'm Lori Ferguson with South Central Economic Development District, and I am your host today for our webinar. We are live streaming. If you had joined us earlier, you may have heard Sherry talk about this. We're live streaming today's webinar on YouTube. So if you have any questions about that link or that feature, feel free to send a chat message to Sherry, which the chat box is located at the bottom of your screen. So, okay. We also like to keep you updated on the growth of HomeNE, and we shared with our speakers earlier that this year has just been amazing. I chose this graphic, you see, not because I thought we were going to talk about gardening and the growth of tomatoes, but because I am a farmer's daughter. But if you've ever heard Sharon and myself talk about HomeNE, we oftentimes liken HomeNE to tilling the soil, followed by the planting of seeds, so that eventually our communities are enabled and can experience local housing success in whatever shape that may be for their own community. So as they successfully address their housing needs, we see that come to fruition. So I hope all of you understand and are experiencing that in your own communities as well. So also along the lines of growth, I just wanted to kind of look back briefly and share with you. The upper left is the slide from our very second webinar of HomeNE that we did in March of 2018, and you can see the attendees across the state of Nebraska for that webinar. Today, we have 128 different Nebraska communities represented in our HomeNE Learning Network. And that doesn't even include the, I think we're up to 7 or 8 states that individuals have joined us from as well. So HomeNE continues to grow, and that's because of all of you. So let me just share some statistics about today. As of about, a half an hour ago, I think Sherry updated me, we had 122 individuals register for today's webinar, and 31 of you are first-time participants. So I just want to give a shout out to some of those new communities. We've got the communities of Allen, Bruning, Coleridge, Glenville, Hebron, which I have also been told can be pronounced Hebron, Imperial, Talmadge, and Wallace. So thank you for joining us. If this is your first time joining us, thanks for checking out HomeNE, and we hope that you'll find it informative and make future participation a priority. And the growth of HomeNE has also been made possible because many of you join us regularly, even monthly, and you are our support network, and we thank you for that as well. So, and today we have the pleasure of hearing from Casey Balitz and Jason Kennedy from the Nebraska Community Foundation as they answer our question, how can charitable assets be a partner in local housing solutions? So one more public service announcement for you before I turn it over to Sharon Heffley to introduce our speakers. I've already mentioned it, many of you have used it already. We just want you to use the chat box as a means of communication. We'll be monitoring that. It can be a communication with us. It can be a communication device with each other, but really make that useful to yourself. We'll be monitoring that for questions of our speakers. And so to kind of get you acclimated to the chat box, I'd like to have you answer or respond to the questions that you see on your screen, and those will be in your chat box momentarily. But we want to know a couple things from you today. Number one, what interests you about today's topic? Why did you join us today? What interests you? And number two, what do you hope to know more about at the end of today's webinar? And that's an invitation just to respond to those questions. Nothing is off limits. We just want to know what you're thinking about today's topic. So HomeNE is a learning network, and this is a great way for us to learn from each other. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon Heffley, the Executive Director here at South Central Economic Development District. Sharon?
Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to the June edition of the HomeNE webinar. It's good to see you all here. We knew our numbers went up when everything else shut down, but now that things are opening up, we're excited to see that you're still with us, and I think we're going to have to get Casey and Jason to join us more often because it seems like they're creating quite a draw here, and that's awesome. South Central Economic Development District, or SCED as we call it, serves as the lead agent for these monthly webinars and semi-annual gatherings according to my notes. However, that's going to be annual this year. We'll just cut out this semi and you can all figure out why, or you can keep guessing. I just want to tell you a little bit about what is HomeNE. Like Lori said, it's a learning network. It was established in 2017, and we created this for people like you. We want you to be able to build a network of individuals and communities with a shared interest in assessing and addressing housing issues in your rural communities. We want to provide a safe space to be vulnerable about what's been tried and find motivation to take one more step in the right direction, to learn from the successes and struggles of others, to take away new ideas or see things through a new lens, and to inspire you. What you're doing is valuable. No one can or will do it quite like you, and now is the time to leave your mark on the universe. So many other things marking our universe right now. I hope that today you will have something to take away to make a real positive mark that you can look back and say, 2020 was a great year because, and it'll be something really good that happened in your community around housing. Today we're going to hear from Casey Balitz and Jason Kennedy from the Nebraska Community Foundation. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Casey's currently the Chief Operating Officer of the Nebraska Community Foundation, and as such, he works with their staff, volunteers, donors, and organizational partners to impact the future of Greater Nebraska. He's based in Columbus, but spends part of his time at the Lincoln office and travels regularly to work with Nebraskans across the state. As a former member of NCF's Board of Directors and a Fund Advisory Committee member of the Columbus Area Future Fund, Casey has a deep appreciation of NCF's culture and accomplishments. He previously served as president of the Columbus Area Chamber of Commerce. He's a native of Columbus, graduated Columbus High School and Northeast Missouri State University, which is now Truman University, He and his wife, Colleen, are the parents of a daughter, Emerson, and she's a student at UNL. Jason joined Nebraska Community Foundation in 2016 and serves as the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer. He's responsible for financial reporting, regulatory compliance, human resources, and administrative matters for the foundation. He works closely with the development team, fund advisory committee members, and investment managers to provide top-notch service to their affiliate funds and donors. Jason spent most of his professional career with the University of Nebraska Foundation, working his way from junior accountant to the position of Senior Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and Treasurer. His previous experience included being a member of the executive team with primary responsibility for managing the financial assets of the foundation. He was the key liaison responsible for working with the foundation's investment, finance, and audit committees and implementing strategic plans with the board of directors. Jason also serves as treasurer for the Nebraska Alumni Association and other affiliated entities of the foundation. He's worked with donors regarding all types of gifts, including life income arrangements. Jason's a member of the Nebraska Society of Certified Public Accountants. He's a volunteer coach for numerous youth sports leagues, and he and his wife, Tracia, have 3 teenage sons who attend Norris Public Schools. So I had the opportunity to visit with these guys in March by phone, and I know that you are in for a treat. So with that, gentlemen, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with everybody this afternoon. It is a topic that's of great interest, and we know that. And I want to maybe set one specific boundary around that topic to start. And that is really what you see on the slide here. What we're talking about today are housing activities that really serve that 501c3 charitable tax-exempt purpose. And, you know, the title of the presentation used the word partner, and really I think that's important. I think charitable dollars are a partner in doing housing development, but there are limitations on how they can be used in this framework. And so there are going to be other partners that need to be at the table along with a philanthropic perspective in most cases to do the kinds of housing activities that you all want to do in your hometown. So just a reminder as we start out that, you know, we're not talking today about what you should or shouldn't do in housing. In a general sense, what we're talking about today is really that charitable purpose. And so I think that's an important framework to start with. A very brief picture of the Nebraska Community Foundation. For those who are not familiar, these are the places that we have an affiliated fund. The shaded areas are county-wide funds, and then you see all the other communities where we have an affiliated fund or another sort of presence. And you'll note the date was almost a year ago, so pleased to tell you that it has grown some since then, but this gives you a good idea of the kinds of places where we are doing some work. Next slide, Sherry. And then this is just a snapshot of who we are and what we do. We really leverage 1,500 or so volunteer fund advisory committees, committee members, some of whom are on with us today to do work in their place. The Nebraska Community Foundation is a very unique structure where those decisions, the fundraising, the grant making, the community impact, all of those things happen in a local framework. We are not doing those things from the home office in Lincoln nearly as much as they are happening in Stratton and Deschler and Coleridge and everywhere in between. So again, you can see about 260 communities across the state, 44,000 some contributions in the last 5 years, and that's probably one of the more important numbers beyond the dollars, that it really is a lot of our fellow Nebraskans who are using philanthropy as a tool. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. How do we put these resources in place in a local context so that they are available to do whatever needs to be done? And it is important to say, as you look at those things, you know, nowhere on there do you see housing, right? So we want to be clear that Nebraska Community Foundation is not a housing organization. Jason and I are not housing experts. That's not what we do. And we don't really make direct grants either. So we're not advocating that you should or shouldn't do these things, or that you really need to get into housing with a charitable purpose behind it. But housing is clearly one of the universals in Greater Nebraska. We hear it from all of those 236 affiliated funds. And we have funds like Stewart, more recently in Keith County and Ogallala, and others who really have done a fair amount of good work in their local community. And so we've learned some things along the way. And specifically what we're sharing today came from a partnership with Laura Husky and Midwest Housing Development. And she and we agreed that this kind of information would be a good tool for Nebraska communities to have. And so we engaged Klein Williams, and Katie is with us today, so that if there's questions that Jason and I are not prepared to answer, we're going to give all the hard ones to Katie. And we're very pleased that both Laura and Katie were able to join us today as well, and our partners in doing this work. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, and I will turn it over to Jason for the first portion here.
All right, thank you, Casey. And as Casey said, that's absolutely right. This isn't maybe what we do. I think we identified a need with the Midwest Housing Development Fund, and we identified the need, and just want to present this kind of as like one option, right? This is maybe one tool that can possibly be used. There are lots of others out there that can, address different parts of housing. But as we talk about here, we're talking about tax exempt and what you can do with charitable money for this. Again, in general, just as an overview, in general, Nebraska Community Foundation is a 501c3 tax exempt corporation. We have to make sure, as all 501c3s, that we provide a benefit to the public. There has to be a charitable class that we are providing benefits to, and I think that's pretty important to keep in mind as we go along here, because you can obviously define that in many different ways, and the IRS says, and I won't necessarily get into that right now, but that is key, is that we can't benefit private individuals, private corporations, businesses, those types of things directly. It has to be something that benefits the public or the greater good. So with that said, we kind of came up with three categories, and the three categories are generally exempt. So that means that, for the most part, these are all going to be exempt, and we can do something. And again, I guess I should say part of this too is, part of the benefit of being a 501c3 is you're exempt from income tax as an organization, but also that the individuals and corporations are able to, if their personal situation allows, they're able to take a tax deduction for donations to Nebraska Community Foundation or other 501c3s. So that's why we have to stay within these rules, is because the IRS is giving those tax benefits. So category 1 is generally exempt. Category 2 can qualify exempt. We'll look at some fact specific things. And then category 3 is generally these areas are not going to be exempt, and you're not going to be able to use charitable money for that area. So I'll talk about kind of those three areas briefly, and then we'll get into, I'll pass it back to Casey and get into some other areas. So category 1, generally exempt. You have the safe harbor affordable housing. Safe harbor is generally done with the application to be an exempt organization. So this is generally from the organization standpoint, and they have to meet some certain requirements. The requirements generally are that 75% of residents have to be low income that occupy, the residence that you have. For each project that they do, either 20% have to be occupied by what they consider very low income, or 40% have to be, cannot exceed 120% of the very low income. So again, these are people that in their application, they're saying, we really want to, this is a part of our mission. Part of our nonprofit mission is we are going to go out and serve these people, and no more than 25%, so the opposite of the 75% that's serving the low income, no more than 25% are rented to or rented at market rates to those that may be above that low income limit. So you know, if you've got a safe harbor, affordable housing, if you've gone that route to get your exempt application, when you apply for your application, generally, for the most part, now again, it's the IRS, and so they always talk about facts and circumstances, and they look at each individual thing, but generally, safe harbor affordable housing, you can use charitable money to help with that. So that's one. Down payment assistance for exclusively low-income individuals or families. So again, low-income individuals and families, and they can be defined by the rates that are put out. If we're giving assistance, down payment assistance just for them and nobody else, they're a charitable class. They qualify as a charitable class, and so we're helping that. So anything in that area is going to qualify as exempt. So that's kind of the second area. And then the third area has to do with educational activities related to housing, including public policy work. So there can be just, you know, you can go out and do webinars, you can go out and you can do certain things that qualify for even policy work as it works out. You know, you can urge residents to clean and repair deteriorated property. You can encourage realtors to use non-discriminatory sales practices. Just lots of different areas in this educational activity. Again, you're making it available to the public. You're not limiting and saying, oh, I'm only going to go to developers or something like that. You're making this available to the public, and you're working on these educational activities. So that's another area of a type of an expense that can be considered exempt and can run through a 501c3. So if we'll go to the next slide. The next one is our category 2. Again, these might qualify as exempt, very fact specific. So each one you're going to have to look at, and you're going to have to determine at that point, does this qualify as exempt or not? Some non-safe harbor affordable housing. So again, you're still working on affordable housing, but maybe that's not what you as an organization, what the 501c3 organization, maybe that's not their main purpose or their main mission, but it still qualifies to meet their mission. And so you can work with that. Again, you're going to have to go in very specifically and show that this is what you're after, and that you're not, that you're primarily helping out those in the affordable housing area, not those that are at market rate or anything like that. So you have to look at that. Down payment assistance, we talked about down payment assistance to low income. This is down payment assistance to low or moderate income families, but it's in an economically depressed area. So if you've got an area that for whatever reason something has happened, maybe it's a natural disaster, maybe it's just the area itself has been declared economically depressed in one way or the other, and if you can show that you're helping even some low and some moderate income families in that area, because that will help bring up the whole area. Again, you're helping the public with that. That might be, again, fact specific, that might be an area that charitable dollars can go help for. The third area on here, rehabilitating, renewing deteriorated or lower income areas. As far as the rehabilitating, sometimes we get involved with tearing down a dilapidated property. Generally, in that case, it's going to have to be the municipality has to take it over first. The municipality owns it. We can grant the municipality so that they are able to go in, tear it down, so that a newer, better building, again, in a lower income area, can be built and build up that area. So that's kind of an area that we've done a few things with and we've worked with. You kind of, again, back to what KC talked about with you need partners. In a lot of these areas, you have to have partners that you're working with. And so my example that I just came up with, you're going to have to be working with the village or the city council, or you're going to have to be working with them, and because there's going to have to be a lot of steps that they're taking as well, not just the charity itself. And you're going to have other partners working with you in this area. But if done right and if done together, you can definitely help in certain areas of this. And then the next one is the promotion, facilitation of racially, ethnically integrated communities. So trying to integrate communities racially, ethnically, working on that. Some of this might go back to the education, and some of there can be different areas. Again, like I said, this is all very fact specific. You'll go to the next slide, please. So go back one. Staying in category 2, staying in category 2. So we're still in the fact specific. This is continued. Providing housing to groups unable to obtain it because of discrimination. We've determined there is discrimination, and so we can step in and help with those groups that are being discriminated against. Now, obviously, again, there's this is not something that you just snap your fingers and is done. These are areas that you have to work on, and you have to go through quite a few steps with this. Housing, the next area, housing serving the needs of elderly persons and or individuals with disabilities. So again, we're talking about charitable classes, and there are some other things that you have to qualify, especially with the elderly, that you have to provide, that you have to work on, especially as it relates to healthcare. Doesn't mean you have to have healthcare in the building, but you have to make sure that you have healthcare available to elderly persons and stuff. So you have some other things that you really have to work on with these areas to make sure that you're providing, because they are considered charitable classes, and so you're directing to that charitable class. And then the last little thing here in this category, housing activities that fulfill an acknowledged governmental obligation. Again, a local political subdivision of some kind, municipality, village, city, whatever that is, they have some obligation, and maybe they're having trouble overall with their budget, and this is an area that the charity can help fulfill, because they have this obligation to fill as it relates to housing, and that maybe can help them in other areas. But again, you're going to have to work with that governmental agency or the political subdivision. You're going to have to work with them and make sure to verify that you get to a comfortable place that this is fulfilling that need. So now if we go to category 3, and again, so that's the end of those that are fact specific. Now we go to category 3 and talk about those that are generally not exempt. For the most part, none of these are going to qualify, and you're not going to be able to use charitable money for any of this. Down payment assistance funded from seller fees, and or operating with interested party identified to grant committee. So again, if we're not dealing with that low income or low to moderate in economically distressed or something like that, it's generally not, you're not going to be able to use charitable money, and you're jeopardizing, I guess, the status of maybe the 501c3 if you try to do that, because that's probably the biggest from an organizational standpoint. That's probably the biggest penalty, is that you'll lose your tax exempt status. You won't be able to operate as you have been. The second item here, down payment assistance exclusively for moderate and greater income families. So again, we're not dealing with the low to moderate. For the most part, you're just not going to be able to use charitable money. And then the third area here, construction and sale or rental of housing units at market rates without some other associated charitable or educational activity. So if it's just, well, it'd be great to have a new development come to our area. That's probably going to be pretty tough just to use it without, again, finding some other partner or finding some other charitable educational activity that you're doing along with that to be able to help. So I think that's the end of the categories. So I will, oh, there was one more. I'm sorry. I forgot about that one. I forgot about that. Sorry about that. So the last one is construction, sale, rental of housing exclusively to moderate and higher income families. So which doesn't take a lot of, we've already talked a lot about that. So with that, I will pass it back to KC.
Thank you, Jason. So as Jason went through that, there are things that you can and things you cannot do, and then there's a bunch of things in the middle. And so what we asked Katie, Joseph, and her colleague Andrew at Klein Williams to do is to help us think about what could you do? What can we do in Nebraska with charitable dollars in housing? And so these were 6 project models that through several months of discussion, we all came to and asked Katie to really look into more deeply. And so I'll share with you some ways that you probably can use charitable dollars for these particular kinds of projects, again, with all the caveats that Jason shared with you. So that was a great foundation that you got to keep in mind. And now let's talk about a few specifics of how could you do these things. Okay, so I'm going to take the first 4 as sort of the first chunk here. Down payment assistance, rehab, equity for rental housing, and residential lot acquisition and preparation. So those 4 have a fair number of similarities. So generally, they're all going to have to serve a defined geographic area. And you're going to hear phrases like physical, economic, or social deterioration, and blighted or disadvantaged. And so for some of you, that's going to bring to mind tax increment financing laws. And those laws can, in fact, be helpful for you in determining how might the IRS look at a charitable contribution to some of those kinds of projects in that defined geographic area. So those are good tools in determining that defined geographic area. I would tell you one of the things anyway that I learned through this process that I didn't really know in my past work in housing, when you're looking at how you define that place that's losing population, losing jobs, or if people can't find housing, those are potentially defining characteristics. And I'll bet many of you on the call today would say there's people that can't find housing in your place. And so that was one that I thought was of particular interest to lift up to you in defining that geographic area. So that's one pretty common theme across those 4. You're going to have to define the area. And then talking about down payment assistance specifically, we'll look at just a couple aspects of each. Going to have an appraisal, going to have an inspection of that home, going to have to provide education to that prospective home buyer, just as Jason was talking about. And one other note I'd make on that one, it does have to be income limited, of course, but it can, in some cases, be more than the AMI. You just have to have a reasonable way of justifying that. when the IRS comes and asks you that question. So I know there's always a question about, particularly if we're talking about workforce housing. What is that? How is that defined in terms of income? So I thought that was helpful to lift up as well, because another bit of information I learned is that really the IRS doesn't define workforce housing very concretely. And so you're going to have to just make the case in some of those instances. Moving to rehab of existing homes, in addition to the things we've already talked about, one note here, if you're going to use charitable dollars for that, it needs to result in the sale of that house at or below cost to a low or moderate income buyer. But one caveat or addition to that is that it could be a rental. You could take an existing home, rehab it, and it could become a low to moderate income rental, which I think would be of interest in some of the places where some of you are from. And Katie lifted up, as did Laura, that there are some existing DED frameworks around rehab that might also be helpful for you in determining what's likely to be considered charitable. Talking about equity in rental housing, one specific to that is that it's going to require a study first, indicating that there is a need for rental housing in your place, that there aren't private developers lining up to do that work on their own due to economic risk, which is going to go back to that defined geographic area. And this would be one where it's going to be the first of many places where we really lift up the need for collaboration with local government. Jason talked about some of that as well. Most of these project models are going to require partnership with the local village board, city council, et cetera. One other note on this one, and I'm sure some of you have run into it, but to be charitable, you're going to have to limit the private benefit to the developer. Otherwise, it's just a market rate development, and they take the risk. So there's going to have to be some limits on what that private benefit's going to be, or it will violate that C3 status. Again, development's going to have to be affordable for low and moderate income families. Generally, what we're looking at there is renters with income of 80% of area of AMI. So 80% is sort of the magic number there. Talking about residential lot acquisition and prep, I think from the experiences I've had, this would probably be an area that there is some interest in a lot of places in greater Nebraska. So same geographic area needs to be defined. There needs to be some safeguards or guidelines that's going to make it likely that that lot will be used by a low to moderate income family or rental. And the development districts in our conversations with Midwest Housing and Klein Williams were lifted up as organizations, as many of you know, or that are active in looking for those maybe problem properties where this might become a tool that you might want to look at. So another partner that should be at the table is those development districts to help you identify where you've got some likely candidates, because I think this really is a place where I think there is opportunity for charitable money to be used. I think that taking a dilapidated home, dilapidated structure of any sort, and making that a usable residential lot, I think really does hold some promise. And we've certainly seen success, as I mentioned earlier, in Stewart, and I'm sure other places as well. So those four have a lot of similarities. Number 5, senior housing has a few differences from those other 4. And Jason referenced some of them, but just to lift those back up, you're going to have to, again, begin with a financial feasibility study that's going to identify the needs and the area to be served and those things, so that you're improving the odds that that senior housing facility is going to work in that place. And that makes a lot of sense, because among the requirements or restrictions that you're going to have to live with to use charitable dollars is that the rental charges are going to have to be affordable, and there needs to be an arrangement that if a person who's in that senior housing becomes unable to meet their regular charge, that you're going to be able to maintain them in that residence. So you do want to be cautious on the front end if you're developing senior housing from a financial perspective. And Jason did mention earlier, I believe, that the requirement for healthcare does not mean that the healthcare has to be provided on site as part of that, but you're going to have an arrangement with, for instance, a next door healthcare facility, or there needs to be a justification that you've got that service provided for those residents. So there are some unique aspects to using charitable dollars for senior housing. And then we move to number 6, which is really probably the biggest bucket here. And Jason referenced it earlier. One of the fairly safe uses for charitable dollars is to support local governments, to remove the burdens of local government. So grants to government could support any one of those first 5. If you're working with your village board, city council, municipality, whatever, county, that grant to the government entity can really be used in any of those 5. And it's probably one of the good ways to use those charitable dollars in any one of those 5 project models. One of the suggestions we'd have along those lines is that a resolution, an ordinance passed by that city council that says, we are interested in doing this work in partnership with these entities to create housing and public benefit. That resolution or ordinance, something that's on the record in an official capacity, is a great way to show the IRS that you're relieving the burden of government, that you're working with that local governmental entity. So that, if you don't already have that, would probably be a good tangible step to walk away from today with. So in general, I think there's 4 general tenets that come out of that. Work with your local government, low to moderate income, define geographic area that relates to those first 2, and then public benefit, improving the conditions in your place for all citizens, for the community, not an individual benefit to either a business or an individual family. I think those would be 4 kind of general factors that are going to figure into your ability to use charitable dollars in housing. So I think as we go then toward, let's go one more slide, Sherry, and then we'll have a little discussion. And I think this is important, that you, regardless of those other factors, you really do need to remember to consider the purpose of the specific tax-exempt organization that you're working with or that you are a part of. And most are going to have that purpose that Jason talked about early on, and that's going to need to fit this. If the stated purpose in your IRS documentation doesn't include housing or doesn't include the geography you're wanting to work in, then that's going to be a pretty significant hurdle. So despite or in addition to all of those other factors we've talked about, also don't forget, you really do need to look at the purpose of the tax-exempt organization that you are hoping to work with. All right, with that, Sherry, I think we're ready to go to the next one, and I'd probably do 2 things. Certainly happy to have just open conversation, but also wanted to say thanks to Klein Williams and specifically to Katie for her work in preparing this information. And it wouldn't have happened without Laura Husky and Midwest Housing Development Fund coming to Nebraska Community Foundation to try to create this mutual tool that we can share across our state. So thanks to both of them. And I would certainly invite either Katie or Laura, if there's specific items that you'd really like to lift up or in my case, likely correct, that is certainly appropriate as part of this conversation.
This is Katie. I'll just pop in very briefly to say great job summarizing the basic principles of what can be a pretty dry topic, Casey and Jason, and to thank you all for the privilege of working on this. I grew up in McCook. and my heart is still in Greater Nebraska, and it's exciting to think about ways to use guidance that was really developed for metropolitan areas to work for rural communities.
All right, Sharon, Lori, we're happy to have an open conversation.
Sounds great. Let's have some Q&A time with our presenters. So if you've got some questions, we're going to have a virtual town hall with Casey and Jason, and maybe Katie and Laura if they are so inclined to jump into the conversation. But we want to know what questions might have been bubbling up to the surface for you. And Laura, do you have something you'd like to share?
Yeah, just a couple of things to build off of what Casey and Jason did here. And great job, by the way. And I've been working on this project. Katie, it's been really helpful, and I'm excited to see what communities are able to pull together with this information. For those of us that work typically day to day inside of the government housing programs and think in that sort of framework, I just want to throw a few things out there. In my experience in listening through philanthropy and working with the, looking at IRS parameters, as Casey pointed out, the IRS doesn't say low income means 80% of AMI according to the CDBG program, blah, 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 blah. They're not going to tell you that. But if you look to a lot of those traditional industry programs like Community Development Block Grant, or even the State's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, where there's been a government guidance, it's a good place to go to for that building your case as to that's why, that's who you're serving. I know in our programs, we've worked some with not necessarily limiting who lives there, but limiting the price so that to make sure those folks would be available. There's a lot of ways to look at this, but you're going to still, if you're stepping into something you haven't done before, as I'm sure Nebraska Community Foundation tells their clientele all the time, you got to get your own legal decision on, you know, what's right for you, what you're comfortable with. The other thing I wanted to point out that as you see questions about can we do this or can we do that, just like with a lot of other things, the answer is going to be maybe. So it's continuing to just ask folks. Yeah, we were thinking about doing this, and we feel like it's a really important community public good. If you feel like you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, then it's probably not. Some of it is just that kind of instinctively how hard you're having to try to make it fit for it to work. So I encourage you to continue to use the resources of HomeNE. You can call me, working with the foundation, just to be able to continue the conversation and not necessarily get overwhelmed in some of this, like, oh, I can't figure out what we can do. You still should have your local community goals and your planning be where you start. Like, this is what we need in our community. Now let's back up. The other thing I wanted to mention, we talked about kind of logistically, is a community foundation. In my mind, the way this works kind of within our, what everybody is pretty much familiar with, would work with either the local government, which we've talked about, or with potentially a nonprofit. There would not be a scenario where a community foundation is going to work with a for-profit developer directly or a buyer of housing directly in most cases. I'm not just saying it's not possible, but that's not really what I was envisioning, and I don't think any of us were envisioning as a sort of strategy. So those of you that are out there that are nonprofits, like Casey said, we talk a lot about development districts and their role in this discussion and conversation. So keep thinking about that. And I just wanted to end with, if anybody wants to keep kind of digging into this idea of lot preparation and preparing sites for affordable housing, I'd love to continue that conversation, because I hear it a lot from communities, and I think we're still trying to find the right resources for that. And this may or may not be it in your community. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Laura.
I might just ask, we'll be sharing Casey and Jason's contact information here in a little bit, but if Katie and Laura, would you mind just typing in your contact information into the chat box so that if people want to follow up with the two of you, they have that available to them. That would be great. So a question that came early in the conversation, an individual wanted to know at the end of today, maybe, or to have a better idea of how cooperation can be started where none or little exists. What's a good starting point? And Laura maybe touched on it a little bit, but Casey, Jason, Katie, or Laura, do you have just what's the next step for somebody who really is just new to this? What's a good starting point?
Well, I'll give you the generic answer or the general answer, and then there may be more specifics. But I think the Nebraska Community Foundation model would say go have a conversation. If you don't know where to start, go talk to people and see who else is interested in your community. Those solutions are generally going to come because relationships are put in place. And you know, today's presentation is a great example because NCF and Laura had a relationship, and so you just talk about things, right? And from that comes solutions. And so I think in your local place, if you don't know where to start, that's the place to start. Go have conversations, build relationships with some of the entities that would fit some of the descriptions we're talking about today. Maybe it's the development district, maybe it's a housing nonprofit, maybe it is probably City Hall or the Village Hall. Have those conversations, and I would guess in most places in greater Nebraska anyway, it isn't going to be very long before you pretty well know who you need to talk to in that place.
Okay, good.
I would add to that some of what not to do. If you are an organization that's working on affordable housing, calling up your trustees or staff of your local foundation and saying, I've had this project, you told me you wouldn't fund it, but now I know you can because I heard that this is possible. Right? I mean, when we talk about building relationships, we're not necessarily talking about with our hand out right away. It's more involving those folks that are looking at the community's needs. If you don't already have groups that are talking in general about not just housing, but across the board, what in community development the needs are there to serve people, and then to take it from there to this is what we think we need, this is the financing we know about. And I have faith that there's enough folks around the table, most of these communities that are associated with their local foundations, they're going to step up where they know that they can and where it fits their mission. But foundations are private organizations that have individual missions and purposes. So just because down the road somebody was able to or found financing, your foundation may not be able to or interested for a variety of reasons. So I think, and that's true of when you're working with local governments and others as well. But I think for those of us that work a lot with government funding, we get too used to, oh, well, these are the rules, so everybody can do it that way. And it's not that way when you're working with charitable dollars, which is a real plus, by the way, because that means there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of openness to talk about that. But that's just kind of how you don't want to enter into it. But I think it's just putting it out there. Like if you thought about this need that we have in the community, and from what I hear locally, and certainly Casey and Jason work with the community foundations directly a lot more than I do, is there's a willingness in community foundations always to see what's possible and to talk about how they might be able to add value for the community. That's what they're there for. So they may not be able to say, oh yeah, sure, that sounds great right away, but I really doubt anybody's going to turn you away from the discussion.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. I have a question. What is there available to an area that might be predominantly farmland and so therefore doesn't meet or get the low moderate income levels? A little bit higher income, but the need is great in the community. So what options are there for that area of the state or that community? Is there something that can creatively be utilized in their area where they don't meet the low moderate income threshold or levels for this kind of partnership?
I guess I'll jump in real quick. I think the first thing I'd say is you might be surprised. More geographic areas, especially in the state of Nebraska, qualify than you think do. So I would double check on that. So that'd probably be the first thing that I would say. And again, as it relates to, okay, let's say it's not. Nope, we don't qualify. Absolutely not. Then. Well, again, I think it's back to KC. Well, let's start a conversation and let's see what can we do. Is maybe it's just the educational part. Maybe, you know, because you're still going to be able to do some of these things. Maybe it's we're going to have to say that one part is going to be for low to moderate housing, which it's never has. I don't know. That's going to get into that facts and circumstances, very specific item. But I have been surprised that when you look at the map and what the IRS thinks is low to moderate income and geographic areas that qualify for maybe underdeveloped, there's a lot more than you think there are in the state.
I would add this thought going back to where we started on defining that geographic area that qualifies. Remember, we're talking about has experienced or is at risk of experiencing physical, economic, or social deterioration. So losing population, losing jobs, if people can't find housing, there are factors there that don't relate directly to low to moderate income. Clearly, LMI is a big one. There's no question that's a significant factor, but there are others that you might want to do a little research on.
I would add, Corey, I challenged the question a little bit on charitable, using charitable dollars, but even just using any dollars. Is it really unrealistic to think that you might have 20% of the individuals that would be living in this area that are low income? We do want to have mixed income developments in communities. Look at what low income means. A lot of communities are not aware of what that actual wage threshold is. Lots of times it's your teachers, it's your law enforcement. It's not necessarily folks that are not working right now. And so I would start there and make sure that's what you're talking about. And then whenever I get a just straightforward question, we want to find a way to subsidize higher income housing units because that's who we want to attract to our community. I'm going to push back some on that because you should be building for what people in your community need. And it's not a build it and they will come kind of industry. So if you're looking at subsidy, then that's probably an indicator you may not have a market for a real market for what you're trying to build there. So just some things to keep in mind as you put the question out. Communities absolutely need workforce housing and they need them at all income levels. We know that. I just don't know that dollars is the place to look at. The other thing in a community in that situation is, are those folks that you're looking to move out to that area living in houses in town now that they'd like to step up to the next house? They have the income, the ability, they just don't have the supply. Then you do have the market and you may not need the subsidy. What you may need is some help for down payment for people to buy their homes or to rehabilitate their homes so they can make it financially work.
Okay, thank you. I'll have the individual asking the question follow up with the three of you and share their specific location or demographics, and maybe you can walk them through that and have that conversation. So good. Okay, so as we begin to wrap up, I'd like to just know from all of you or some of you, what's an aha moment for you from today? What are you taking away from today's session? Maybe it's an aha moment. Maybe it's an action item. What are you walking away from today is when we conclude our webinar? Feel free to open up your microphone and just share something. For me personally, it's been an eye-opening session I've not had the opportunity to listen to this, but it really can be a great tool in our rural communities. So, okay.
You know, something that keeps coming back is we have to be careful when we're on a webinar to think, oh, we all have to have this particular asset in our community. You know, we tend to kind of have envy of what's going on in another community, and community foundations are an incredible asset. And I am really glad that we were able to bring these guys to tell you about that. But they aren't the only asset. And so don't be thinking, oh, how can I get my square peg to fit into this round hole? It may be an incredible fit for your community. You may already have a foundation, and maybe we need to look at how can we expand to do some of these things. And Casey and Jason and Laura and Katie are all great resources for that. But just remember, you know, we're in our 3rd year of doing webinars. We've brought you all kinds of tools. And I find as we look to invest our rural workforce housing dollars, we being SCED, sometimes we'll work with foundations for the lot prep and that kind of thing. Sometimes we're going to work with CRAs. Sometimes we're going to work with the Development Corporation, and they might be using some LB 840 dollars. So every community has a little bit different flavor. And so kind of like Laura said, don't be going and saying, well, now I know you can do this, so you better do it with me, to any one entity, because there are so many options out there. But we also have to look at what's in our hand. What's in our hand? What's in our community? What is that seed that we can be watering, fertilizing, getting to germinate? And maybe it's growing our foundation and doing all these things. And maybe it's using some other avenues and looking then at developing a foundation. And you have the resources right here that can help you do that too. Nebraska Community Foundation. I was privileged to get to go with some of their staff out to Eustis, where they brought 4 of their funds in and talked about all kinds of things. And so there's just some great opportunities there.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Anything else that you'd like to share about an action item or anything? As you're maybe starting to put those in the chat box, here is Casey and Jason's contact information. If you'd like to reach them or get a hold of them, is there a preferred method of communication for the 2 of you?
I think either email or, you know, these days it's cell phone, because we're not in the office as much, and you're always welcome to call. And we will, we sort of synthesize this information into a summary document that we'll share along with the other materials from today.
Right. And that document that Casey just mentioned will be being sent out with the slides from today's presentation to all of our registered participants. So great. So just to give you a little bit of a public service announcement, a couple of you have asked about past webinars, and we do have those on our website. If you want to check out a variety of webinars, as Sharon has mentioned, this is our 3rd year of doing this. And I've listed just some of the past webinar topics that we have had. A couple months ago, somebody suggested we do something on tiny homes, and we actually did a webinar in June of 2018. Nancy Strebel from North Platte talked about the program that they were going and doing very successfully in North Platte. So that is on that website. So these are just some of the topics, and you can kind of scan through those different webinars. We've had community leadership, housing studies, etc. So, you know, just a variety of topics have been covered, and we're always looking for great topics as well. So, and I've just put our HomeNE newsletter there. If you'd like a copy of that sent to you, we have quite a few on hand, and we'd be happy to get that either electronically or snail mail to you. So, next month's topic, I just wanted to share briefly. We've ran over a couple minutes, but I do thank Casey and Jason both for joining us today. You are welcome to come back anytime. I have enjoyed your presentation and would welcome your input and attendance again in the future. Next month, we're going to be In for a real treat, Dr. Dan Hazing, who is the superintendent at Schuyler Community Schools, is going to be joining us July 16th, and he'll be discussing the many successes that the community of Schuyler has had as the school has proactively joined forces with other entities in the community to make the most of the opportunities that they have had and through their partnerships, and just some of the outside the box thinking that's going on both in the school system as well as the community. So you're going to want to sign up for that and join us next month on July 16th. So Casey and Jason, once again, thank you. You are always welcome, as I said. And with that, are there any last comments or questions that you would like to share?
I'll just thank Laura and Katie for providing the resource, and we hope it's of use all across Greater Nebraska, and we're happy to help connect people to the resources, whatever they may be in their place. We certainly believe there are assets and resources in every one of those places that allow good things to happen, so we're happy to be a connector in that way anytime we can.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, thanks again, and we will see you back here again on July 16th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.